At 6:12 on a Monday morning, Michael sat in his truck outside the distribution center where he had worked for 31 years. The building looked exactly as it always had. Fluorescent lights glowing behind gray windows, delivery trailers backing into loading bays, younger employees hurrying inside with coffee in their hands. For more than 3 decades, Michael had never needed motivation to open that door. He simply went in because people depended on him. But that morning, at 57 years old, he remained behind the steering wheel. His resignation letter was sitting in his email drafts. He was not being fired. He was not wealthy. His mortgage still had several years remaining. His mother needed increasing levels of care, and his adult son had recently asked for help paying rent again. By every rule Michael had been taught, leaving now made no sense. Yet staying had begun to make even less sense. This is the brutal reason some Gen X men are retiring early. They are not suddenly afraid of hard work. They are not losing their ambition, and they are not walking away because life became too difficult. They are leaving because they have finally understood the real transaction. They were never selling only their labor. They were selling their remaining healthy years. Gen X men were handed a simple promise when they were young. Work hard. Be loyal. Do not complain. Take care of your family. Delay what you want today, and one day you will earn the right to enjoy your life. So they accepted overtime. They worked weekends. They answered calls during family dinners and postponed medical appointments because somebody needed them at the office. They missed vacations, school events, anniversaries, and ordinary evenings that seemed replaceable at the time. They believed sacrifice was temporary. But temporary became 30 years. Whenever they approached the finish line, the system quietly moved it. The pension disappeared. Healthcare became more expensive. Retirement age seemed less like a destination and more like a negotiation. Their children needed financial help for longer. Their parents lived longer but required more care. The house needed another repair. The company announced another restructuring, and the man who had been told to rest later began to realize that later was already here. At 35, another 5 years of work seemed insignificant. At 57, those 5 years looked different. They might be the last years when his knees still allowed him to hike. The last years when he could drive across the country without constant pain. The last years when his mind, energy, and curiosity could still build something that belonged to him. Michael had watched 3 co-workers retire in the previous 4 years. One had suffered a stroke before completing the trip he had planned for decades. Another spent his retirement caring for a wife who had become seriously ill. The third admitted that he no longer knew what he enjoyed because work had consumed every part of his identity. None of these men had failed. They had simply waited so long to live that life changed before they reached it. That realization began following Michael everywhere. He felt it during pointless meetings where experienced employees were told to be more enthusiastic. He felt it when a new manager described his caution as resistance to change, then asked him privately to solve a problem nobody else understood. He felt it when the company removed another benefit while posting messages about loyalty and community. Michael had trained several of the people now managing him. He had carried the operation through breakdowns, staff shortages, holidays, and emergencies. When a shipment failed at 2 in the morning, nobody called the motivational manager. They called Michael. But when promotion decisions were made, his experience suddenly became a liability. He was told that the company needed fresh energy. Then he was asked to document everything he knew so that younger employees could take over his responsibilities. That was when the illusion finally broke. Michael understood that he had treated the company like a relationship, while the company had always treated him like a resource. The system was comfortable with his sacrifice, as long as he never asked whether the exchange was still fair. It celebrated his reliability, because reliability made him predictable. He would stay late. He would accept one more responsibility. He would repair whatever someone else had broken. He would continue showing up because that was what a good man did. But a predictable man becomes dangerous the moment he starts counting the cost. And Michael had started counting. The cost was not only exhaustion, it was the version of himself that existed only to solve other people's problems. At work, he was the dependable veteran. At home, he was the emergency fund, the repairman, the calm voice, and the person everyone called when their choices created consequences. For years, being needed felt like being loved. Then Michael tried a small experiment. When his son asked for another loan, Michael said no. Not angrily, not cruelly. He explained that he was preparing to reduce his working hours and could no longer keep financing emergencies that repeated every few months. His son became distant. When Michael told his sister that he could not continue paying more than his share of their mother's expenses, she accused him of abandoning the family. When he told his wife that he wanted to leave work before 60, her first question was not whether he was all right. She asked what everyone else would do without his income. That question hurt more than anything the company had done. Michael began to wonder whether the people around him loved him or loved the protection his sacrifice provided. He had spent his entire adult life making sure everyone else felt safe. The moment he tried to preserve a small part of his own future, his boundaries were interpreted as betrayal. This is the emotional trap many Gen X men face when they consider retiring early. The financial calculation is difficult, but the psychological calculation can be even harder. They have been conditioned to measure their worth through usefulness. If they stop producing, rescuing, paying, fixing, and enduring, they fear they will stop mattering. Their identity has been welded to responsibility so tightly that freedom initially feels like guilt. That is why some men remain in jobs that are slowly draining them. They are not only afraid of losing a paycheck, they are afraid of discovering who will remain when the paycheck is gone. The workplace needs them to believe that leaving is irresponsible. Some family members need them to believe that setting limits is selfish. The larger culture needs them to keep chasing a version of success built around endless productivity. A man who steps away early threatens all three. His decision forces an uncomfortable question into the room. What if continuing to sacrifice is not always noble? What if there comes a point when staying is no longer responsibility, but fear disguised as duty? Michael sat in his truck with his hand resting on the steering wheel. For the first time, he could see the structure clearly. His company wanted his knowledge. His family wanted his financial strength. The system wanted his remaining productive years. Everyone had a plan for his time except him. At 6:19, Michael opened his phone and sent the resignation letter. Nothing dramatic happened. The building did not stop. The world did not collapse. But inside him, 31 years of obedience collided with a frightening new possibility. His life might actually belong to him. The hardest part, however, was still ahead. Leaving the job would take one email. Leaving behind the belief that he had to exhaust himself to deserve love would require an entirely different kind of courage. The morning after Michael sent that email, he woke at 4:47 without an alarm. His body was still obeying a schedule his life no longer required. For several seconds, he felt relieved. Then the guilt arrived. Men who had spent decades working rarely know what to do with an empty Tuesday. Rest sounds wonderful when it is unavailable, but when it finally appears, it can feel suspicious. Michael made coffee, opened his laptop, and checked his old work email out of habit. His access had already been removed. That small login failure hit him harder than he expected. Yesterday, people had called him because he knew how everything worked. Today, the system had erased his name from the directory and continued without him. That is one of the first truths a man confronts after leaving a long career. The organization that consumed so much of his life can replace his position faster than he can replace the identity it gave him. For the first 2 weeks, Michael kept himself busy with small repairs around the house. He reorganized the garage, cleaned tools that were already clean, and drove to the hardware store for things he did not really need. He was not enjoying freedom. He was trying to prove that he was still productive. Then one afternoon, his wife found him sitting silently on the back steps. She asked if he regretted leaving. Michael looked across the yard and told her the truth. He did not miss the job. He missed knowing exactly who he was supposed to be every morning. This is the part of early retirement that almost nobody discusses. Leaving work is an external event. Retiring from the belief that your value comes from constant usefulness is an internal reconstruction. Without that reconstruction, a man can escape the building while carrying the entire system inside his head. He can stop receiving a paycheck and still judge every hour by how much he produced. He can leave the manager behind and become an even harsher manager of himself. That is why the solution is not simply to stop working. It is to reclaim the authority to decide what work, rest, responsibility, and success will mean during the next chapter. For Michael, that began with one uncomfortable question: how much was enough? For most of his adult life, enough had never been a number. It was always somewhere beyond the next raise, the next debt payment, the next family emergency, and the next contribution to retirement. The finish line moved because he had never defined it for himself. So Michael and his wife sat at the kitchen table and looked honestly at their life. They separated what they needed from what they had been trained to desire. They did not need a newer vehicle every few years. They did not need to maintain an image of success for neighbors who were probably worried about their own finances. They did not need an expensive life that required Michael to surrender the healthiest years he had left. They needed housing, food, healthcare, dependable transportation, a reserve for emergencies, and enough room to experience life without constant fear. The calculation was not magical. It required compromise. Michael would take occasional consulting work. They would delay one renovation and travel more simply. His wife would continue working for another year because that was her choice. Early retirement did not mean pretending money no longer mattered. It meant refusing to let an undefined appetite consume every remaining year. Not every man can leave his job tomorrow. Some have debt, dependents, medical needs, or financial obligations that make an immediate exit impossible. Romanticizing an unplanned departure can create a different kind of prison. But there is an enormous difference between saying, "I cannot leave today," and saying, "I will never be allowed to leave." The first statement describes a temporary reality. The second surrenders ownership of the future. A wise exit can happen in stages. It may begin by reducing expenses, eliminating debt, building a cash reserve, or moving from 5 working days to 3. It may mean consulting, seasonal work, a smaller home, or a simpler definition of success. The goal is not to demonstrate rebellion by destroying everything. The goal is to create enough space that fear is no longer making every decision. Michael soon discovered that money was only one part of that space. The more difficult task was deciding what he was retiring toward. He had spent years imagining retirement as the absence of things. No alarm, no manager, no commute, no pointless meetings. But absence cannot organize a life. If a man removes every obligation without creating meaning, freedom can slowly become isolation. So Michael stopped asking what he had escaped and started asking 3 different questions. What gives me a reason to get up? Who will notice if I do not show up? What can I build that does not require me to disappear inside it? The answers were modest. That was what made them real. A friend introduced him to a community workshop that repaired furniture for families rebuilding their lives. Michael began going there every Wednesday. Nobody cared about his old title. Nobody asked how many people had reported to him. They cared that he knew how to repair a broken table and that he was patient enough to teach someone else. At first, he approached the workshop like another job. He arrived too early, created lists, and tried to solve every problem. An older volunteer finally laughed and told him, "You are allowed to enjoy this." Michael realized that he had forgotten how. Enjoyment felt irresponsible because it produced no status. But slowly, he began remembering the satisfaction of doing something well without needing it to justify his existence. He also started walking each morning, not to train for an event, not to beat a record, not to turn his body into another project. He walked because his body had carried him through 31 years of sacrifice, and it deserved attention before it forced him to give it attention. This was not laziness. It was maintenance long overdue. The greatest resistance still came from his relationships. His son contacted him again after another financial problem. Michael listened, offered advice, and repeated that he would not provide another bailout. His son accused him of caring more about retirement than family. The old Michael would have surrendered immediately. He would have confused discomfort with wrongdoing and paid the money simply to restore peace. But Michael had finally learned that peace purchased by abandoning yourself is not peace. It is temporary silence. He told his son, "I love you enough to believe you can handle the consequences of your own decisions." Then he ended the conversation without defending himself for another hour. The guilt remained, but this time Michael did not obey it. That distinction changed everything. Feelings can be real without being instructions. Guilt does not always prove that a boundary is wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional withdrawal that appears when a lifelong pattern of self-abandonment is interrupted. People who benefited from the old pattern may resist the new one. They may call a boundary selfish because unlimited access felt normal to them. They may interpret a man's recovery as rejection because his exhaustion once made their lives easier. That does not make them evil. It means the relationship must learn a new shape. Some relationships will adjust. Others will weaken when the sacrifice holding them together disappears. Both outcomes reveal the truth, and truth is more useful than forced harmony. Michael still helped his mother. He still loved his son. He still contributed to his household. Early retirement did not turn him into a man without responsibility. It turned him into a man who could finally distinguish responsibility from rescue. Responsibility says, "I will carry what is mine." Rescue says, "I will carry what is yours so that you never have to become stronger." For many Gen X men, that distinction is the beginning of freedom. The system is not upset because these men have stopped caring. It is upset because they have become more selective about where their care goes. They are no longer automatically donating their health to companies that call replacement loyalty. They are no longer sacrificing their future to protect adults from every consequence. They are no longer mistaking exhaustion for character. And when one experienced man quietly steps away, others begin noticing. They see that the office continues without him, but so does he. They see him sleeping better, speaking more slowly, and making decisions without asking whether a manager will approve. They realize that leaving did not make him irrelevant. It exposed how much of his identity had been rented to institutions that never owned him. That realization upsets a system built on delayed living. The system works best when a man believes his real life will begin later. After the next promotion, after the mortgage, after the children stop needing help, after the company survives another crisis, after his body is too tired to demand anything adventurous. There will always be another reason to postpone freedom. There will always be someone who benefits from his delay. The question is whether he will continue treating his remaining time as if it belongs to everyone else. 6 months after leaving, Michael drove past the distribution center on a Monday morning. For a moment, his hands tightened around the steering wheel. He remembered the pressure, the pride, the friendships, and the version of himself who believed that building could not function without him. Then he saw trailers moving through the loading bays exactly as they always had. The building had survived his departure. More importantly, so had he. He did not feel angry. He did not need the company to fail in order to prove that leaving had been right. His freedom was no longer a protest against the system. It was a decision to stop giving the system authority over the meaning of his life. That is the deeper truth about Gen X men retiring early. They are not necessarily quitting work. Many will continue building, repairing, mentoring, creating, consulting, and serving. Work was never the enemy. The enemy was the belief that their lives had value only when somebody else was extracting something from them. Retirement, at its wisest, is not withdrawal from life. It is withdrawal from an agreement that says a man must keep proving his worth until his body can no longer participate. It is the moment he stops asking, "How much more can I endure?" and begins asking, "What deserves the years I have left?" The answer may be family, but not endless rescue. It may be work, but not total surrender. It may be service, but not self-erasure. It may be solitude, but not isolation. It may be peace, even when other people do not understand it. If you are considering an early exit, do not leave only because you are exhausted. Build something to walk toward. Know what you need, know who you want around you, and know what will give structure to your days when your job no longer does. Most importantly, do not wait for everyone to approve. People who depend on your sacrifice may never agree that you have given enough. A company cannot announce when your soul has reached its limit. Your children cannot decide how much of your future belongs to them. The system will never place your freedom on the calendar and remind you that it is time. That decision belongs to you. You are not weak because endless pressure no longer impresses you. You are not selfish because you want to experience your life while you still have the strength to participate in it. You are not failing because the version of success you accepted at 25 no longer fits the man you became at 55. Perhaps you are not retiring from responsibility. Perhaps you are retiring from being owned. If this story feels familiar, share your age and the responsibility you are finally ready to put down. Someone reading your words may realize that he is not the only man quietly questioning the life he was told to accept. And in the next video, we will explore how Gen X men rebuild purpose after leaving the career that once defined them. Because walking away is only the first act. Learning how to live on your own terms is where the real story begins.